abortion's wrong, because a fetus is a person from the moment of conception, and it'd be wrong to kill a person. And abortion does kill a person if 1 through 3 are right. Okay. You might pause it and make sure that that makes sense, just rewind and review it. But this is kind of, this isn't the exact argument that the Pope gives, but it's really closely related. I think this is this person from the moment of conception style argument against abortion. This is a general schematic form of it, at least as Thomson conceives of it. And it's certainly the sort of thing that the Pope would be on board with. But again, this isn't an argument that Thomson accepts. She's just reviewing an argument that she thinks her opponent might give against abortion. So, why is she reviewing her opponent's argument? Well, she wants to make a few points here. First is that if we just focus on the first 3 steps of the argument, that's 1 through 3 here. We just focus on those first 3 steps. We can see that 1 and 2 don't get us to 3. They don't provide us adequate support for 3. And why is that? Well, it's an oak tree, right? So first, the development of an acorn into an oak tree is a continuous process. Second, to draw a line somewhere in this process and say, before this point, it's not an oak tree, and afterwards it is an oak tree. To do that would be make an arbitrary choice, and that'd be because we can't give any good reason for thinking that it's an oak tree precisely at this point rather than some other one. And then third, what would follow from that is that an acorn is an oak tree right from the beginning. So, what's going on here? The point of this argument, this parallel argument to the abortion one, is to show that 3, first of all, just note that 3 is obviously not true. An acorn is not the same thing as an oak tree. Okay? If you take an acorn that you find on the ground, it's not an oak tree yet. Alright? That's obvious. So, 1 and 2 here, since 3 is false, 1 and 2 obviously don't provide us any reason to believe 3. Even though they attempt to, this argument sucks, right? An acorn is not an oak tree. So why are we talking about acorns and oak trees? Well, the thought is just this. All we did with this argument, we just took the argument against abortion, and instead of talking about fetuses and human persons, started talking about acorns and oak trees. We kept the same style of argument. We could call it arguing from continuity, like the developmental process is continuous, to arbitrariness, or saying because it's continuous you can't, any line you draw would be arbitrary. We just took that same style of argument that we originally used, or Thomson's opponent originally used, against abortion, and applied it to something else. We saw that that didn't work because the conclusion was wrong, that an acorn is an oak tree. So what that seems to show is that this argument also fails in the abortion case. So I'll put it a little bit differently. What this is supposed to illustrate is that the mere fact that something develops continuously, and that it seems arbitrary to try to choose a point at which it transforms into a new thing, whether that be a person or an oak tree, that doesn't mean that the new thing, the person or the oak tree, that's what it is right from the beginning. Okay, so I hope that makes sense. And what I want, you to really take away from this is just to be clear on what this acorn oak tree analogy is supposed to show. We've just talked about it, but just make sure you can sort of take that away from this. So that was really like all in the first page of the text. It's really quite rich paper because right off the bat we've got sort of really fascinating thing to think about. That a human fetus is no more a person than an acorn is an oak tree. All right. What I want to do now is move on to the next important remark she makes. And what she says is that well, let's say this first. I mean, although she just argued against the style of argument, okay, and that was the kind of argument which tries to derive the conclusion that a fetus is a person from the moment of conception, from the fact that it's difficult to draw a line somewhere in the developmental process. Okay, so she just argued against that style of argument by using her acorn oak tree analogy. But although she did that, she actually goes on to admit that, however, that trying to settle this issue of the moral status of the fetus by drawing a line somewhere isn't very promising. Okay, so she can acknowledge that, like, if that's how we're going to try to settle the issue about whether abortion's morally right or morally wrong, if we think we have to be able to draw a line somewhere, that's not going to work very well. She doesn't think that, that has much potential at all. Okay, but she's not contradicting herself here, because she's saying, look, I'll grant you, I don't think we can draw a line somewhere and know that that's the point at which it's a person. But what she did earlier was just to show that that doesn't mean you can assume that the fact that we can't draw a line makes it a person right from the very moment of conception. Maybe we just can't know at what exact moment it is, and that's why it's hard to draw a line. But it doesn't follow from that it is a person right from the very beginning. Okay, and then next, she also thinks, that the fetus probably is a person well before it is born, even though we can't draw that line or do it confidently. But she doesn't think that a fetus is a person right from the moment of conception, even though it may be a person well before it's born. And the reason she thinks that just sort of comes back to this acorn oak tree thing. She says, a newly fertilized ovum, a newly implanted clump of cells, that's what a fetus is, at the moment of conception. That's no more a person than an acorn is an oak tree. Okay, what we need to do now is to notice what comes next in this paper, because it's really important. So, she doesn't think that a fetus is a person right from the moment of conception, because that would be like saying that an acorn is an oak tree. Okay, but even though she doesn't think that a fetus is a person right from the moment of conception, she's going to go on to say, frankly, for the purposes of this debate, it doesn't matter whether a fetus is a person right from the moment of conception or not. It just doesn't matter. So, she says, I'm just going to grant my opponent his claim that a fetus is a person from the moment of conception. I'm just going to say, fine, I'll allow you to have that. I won't argue with you about that. We'll just assume that's true. But even if, she says, even if I assume that a fetus is a person right from the moment of conception, which she doesn't think is true, but she says, fine, let's just assume that is true, I can still prove to you that abortion is morally okay. Alright. Now, the first thing to note here is that if she's right about that it can be proven that abortion is morally okay, even on the assumption that a fetus is a person right from the moment of conception, that would really be quite radical, because it would mean that almost everybody who's been arguing about abortion, by focusing on whether the fetus is a person or whether it's not, they've been doing a bunch of unnecessary work. They've been arguing about something that isn't actually, necessary to settle. In other words, you don't have to figure out whether it's a person or not. We could just assume it is. We still show that abortion's morally okay. So that's part of the reason this paper is so revolutionary, is that if she succeeds, she will have, totally recast the debate. Okay. So, just to make things a little bit clearer, what I want to do is just put up the argument again that her opponent has given against abortion. And this is the one that she started her paper out by discussing, and that I sort of reconstructed. So I'm just going to, here it is again. All right. So 1, 2, 3, and 4. I'm going to come back to this in a second. The idea, so we've already seen that Thomson thinks that the premise that 3 doesn't follow from 1 and 2. That's what we spent time talking about earlier. And it was the acorn-oak tree analogy that was supposed to demonstrate that 3, that 1 and 2 don't guarantee the truth of 3. In other words, that even if 1 and 2 are true, that doesn't mean that 3 is. And that's, the acorn-oak tree thing was supposed to demonstrate the failure of 1 and 2 to get you 3. Okay, but what she's going to do next is to show that even if 3 is true, it's not at all clear that, the conclusion, 4, which says that abortion is morally wrong, that follows from 3. In other words, it's going to say it's not clear that just because a fetus is a person from the moment of conception, that abortion is morally wrong. So that this is the next step of the paper. First, what I want to say, though, is that she thinks that anti-abortion advocates have been spending so much time trying to establish that a fetus is a person from the moment of conception that they've just totally forgotten to explain how the conclusion that abortion is morally wrong is supposed to follow from the fact that it's a person from the moment of conception. Okay, so here's the way I want to put it. I mean, she thinks that people who are opposed to abortion and use this kind of argument to argue for the wrongness of abortion have been focusing on 1 and 2 as ways to get you 3. So they haven't even been focusing on 4. Right? They just think it's obvious that if 3 is true, then you get the conclusion, 4, that abortion is morally wrong. So they've sort of been ignoring that. They've been trying really hard to use 1 and 2 to prove 3. But what Thomson's saying is that this premise, 3, she thinks that 1 and 2 failed to get you 3. But let's just assume that 3 is true. The problem is that these opponents of abortion haven't argued for the connection between 3 and 4. And so that's what she's attacking. Okay. So they don't spend enough time trying to explain how the fetus being a person gets you to the conclusion that abortion is morally wrong, but she thinks that what they must have in mind is something like this. Well, every person has a right to life. Okay, so let me back up. If her opponent has established that the fetus is a person from the moment of conception, then this is what they must have in mind. Well, if it's a person, then it has a right to life, because every person has a right to life. And although the mother has a right to decide what happens to her body, the fetus's right to life is more important than the mother's right to decide what happens to her body. So the fetus's right to life outweighs the mother's right. That means that the fetus can't be killed. It'd be morally wrong to do that. So abortion is morally wrong because abortion is killing the fetus. So make sure that you understand what Thomson, and I've got it italicized here, this is basically what Thomson thinks her opponent must have in mind when they infer 4 from 3. When they infer that abortion is morally wrong from the fact, if it is a fact, that a fetus is a person. Okay. So this might be a good time to just sort of pause and make sure that the kind of tricky stuff that we've been talking about recently, or the past few minutes, makes sense. But this style of argument right here that's supposed to get you from 3 to 4, and again those are on the previous slide, this style of argument, she thinks, fails. Okay. What she's going to do is to try to show that it's just not true that something's being a person and having a right to life automatically means that its right to life outweighs everything else and that it can't be killed. So in the abortion case, what this will mean is that it's just not true that a fetus being a person and having a right to life automatically means that that right to life outweighs the mother's right to decide what happens to her body. But just as a general claim, when we sort of abstract from abortion, what she's going to do is just show that it's just generally not true that if something is a person and has a right to life, that no matter what, that outweighs the rights of anything else that might conflict with it. So she's got a couple different reasons for thinking this. She demonstrates this by way of a handful of very crafty analogies, very innovative and creative analogies. So let's take a look at her first one. And this is the unconscious violinist analogy. What I'm going to do is just read this to you in its entirety because it's important that we have all the details in mind as we move forward. For your reference, this is on page 392, and this is going to take a minute, but pay careful attention to what I've said, especially if it didn't make sense the first time around when you read. So she says, imagine that you wake up in the morning and you find yourself back to back in bed with an unconscious violinist. Okay? A famous unconscious violinist. I'm not sure why the fact that the violinist is famous is relevant. And this seems just kind of bizarre and random. It doesn't really matter that it's a violinist. It's just this example that she's, choosing. So he's been found, this violinist, to have a fatal kidney disease. And the Society of Music Lovers has canvassed all the available medical records, and they found that you alone have the right blood type to help. So what they've done is they've kidnapped you, right? And then last night, the violinist's circulatory system was plugged into yours. And that's so that your kidneys can be used to extract poisons from his blood as well as your own. Right now, the director of the hospital tells you, look, we're really sorry that the Society of Music Lovers did this to you. We would never have permitted it if we'd known. Okay? But still, they did it, and the violinist is now plugged into you. But to unplug you would be to kill him. Because if, we unplug you from the violinist, he's going to die, so the act of unplugging you kills him. But don't worry, it's only for 9 months that you got to be plugged into this guy laying in bed. By then, he will have recovered from his ailment, and he can safely be unplugged from you. Okay, and then she asks, is it morally required of you to accept the situation, right? Is it morally required of you to agree to lay in bed for 9 months so that this violinist doesn't die? And what she says is, it'd be very nice of you if you did this. It'd be very kind of you. But what she wants to know is, are you morally required to do it? She says, what if it were not for 9 months, but for 9 years? Would you then be required to do it? Or what if it was longer still, your entire life? What if the director of the hospital says, tough luck, I agree, but you've now got to stay in bed with a violinist plugged into you for the rest of your life. Because remember this, all persons have a right to life, and violinists are persons. Granted, you have a right to decide what happens to your body, but a person's right to life outweighs your right to decide what happens to your body. So you can't ever be unplugged from him. Now, what you need to ask is, so Thomson says, I imagine that you would regard this as outrageous, right? What this director of the hospital just said to you. What I want to know, I guess, is whether you agree that this would be outrageous. In other words, do you think that it would be actually morally okay to unplug yourself Now, Thomson just assumes that you will think that if you find yourself in this situation, it's morally okay for you to unplug yourself from the violinist. Okay. She thinks it's just obvious that you're morally allowed to do that you wouldn't be doing something morally wrong by unplugging yourself, even though you'd thereby be killing him. Now, what she thinks is that if you disagree with that intuition, you think that you've got to stay plugged into this violinist for 9 months, or if we change the case, 9 years of the rest of your life. If you think that morality requires that of you, then, like, you're on another planet or something. That's crazy. Yes, you'd be killing him by unplugging yourself, but you don't have to stay there in bed for the rest of your life, or even for 9 months. Okay, so if you disagree with her intuition that it's okay to unplug yourself, you've got to really explain, your extremely counterintuitive intuition here. Okay, but let's just assume that you do agree that it'd be okay to unplug yourself, which is what she thinks you will think. But then you must also agree with her that it's just not true that a fetus must not be killed just because it's a person and has a right to life. I'm going to explain why that is, but first let's introduce a qualification here. So what it really would show is that what the violinist case really would show is that well, it seems to be perfectly analogous to a case of abortion where the woman's pregnancy was a result of rape. So go back over the violinist case in the textbook, and anytime you see the word violinist, substitute mother. I'm sorry. Anytime, you see a reference to the person who is stuck in bed, who is plugged into the violinist, substitute mother. And anytime you see violinist, substitute fetus. Okay? And you'll see that it's the same damn argument, right? The thought is, if all we're changing is fetus to violinist, and the person stuck in bed attached to the violinist to the mother, we've got perfectly symmetrical, analogous stories here. So if you think that it's okay for the person who's been kidnapped and attached to this violinist against their will to unplug themselves, even though that would kill him, then you should also think that it would be okay for a mother who's been impregnated against her will to unplug herself from the fetus. Those two cases are supposed to be perfectly symmetrical and analogous, so that if you think the one's okay, you should think the other is okay. So what she thinks is that unless you're crazy, and that you think you can't unplug yourself from the violinist, you must think that abortion is okay in cases of rape. Because it's the same thing. You've got somebody who has a right to life, whether it's a violinist or a fetus, because they're both persons. But it would be outrageous to think that you can't kill that person when you take into account your right to decide what happens to your body. So what she anticipates here is her opponent saying something like this. All right, you've established that in this one kind of case, all right, a person's right to life doesn't mean that it can't be killed. In other words, she thinks her opponent might say, all right, I accept the violinist intuition, and I realize that that means that I must accept that abortion's okay, analogously in a case of rape. But rape is just the one exception where abortion's okay. Because after all your violinist case showed is that if somebody's kidnapped and against their will, being in a situation where they're keeping the other person alive, that it's okay for them to make a decision not to. And the analogous case, in the case of abortion, is a situation where pregnancy results from rape. But that's all you've established. So all I have to do, as her opponent, is say, all right, fine, abortion's okay in cases of rape. But that's just the exception. In other cases, it's not okay. All right, so she anticipates that maybe her opponent will make this move. And she's got a response to this. First, what she wants to do is just call attention to the fact that this position really amounts to this, saying that persons have a right to life and can't be killed only if they didn't come into existence because of rape. You're making an exception for a case of rape. But otherwise, you think that persons have a right to life and can't be aborted. Fetuses, that is. So, to make to say that, like, if you were the product of rape, you don't have a right to life that entitles you not to be killed or aborted. That's really a rather unpleasant view to hold. I mean, it just sounds wrong. It sounds ugly. It sounds like, yeah, everybody's got a right to life, can't be killed, unless you're the result of rape. That just doesn't sound quite right. At least sounds really kind of, I don't know. But second, we can say, as she does, that surely this question of whether you have a right to life at all, that shouldn't depend upon the question of whether or not you're the product of a rape. I mean, that just seems totally irrelevant, right? It's not as though the fetus that is the product of a rape did anything, to waive their right to life. It's not their fault that they were the product of rape, right? So, even though this is her response to the person who responds to her argument by saying, all right, you've convinced me abortion's okay in cases of rape, but I'm still opposed to abortion in other cases. Right? So that's her response to somebody who holds that view. But she thinks actually that this point is moot. Why? Because she doesn't think that very many people are going to do that, going to say abortion's okay, but only in cases of rape. And in particular, somebody who opposes abortion on the grounds that a fetus is a person and has a right to life, somebody who has that reason for opposing abortion, won't even make an exception for cases of rape, precisely because they'll say a fetus is a person from the moment of conception, they've got a right to life, they can't be killed. And they'll think that it doesn't matter whether you're the product of rape or not. So for this kind of person, here's the upshot, right? They must either think, well, what they must think is that it'd be wrong to unplug yourself from the violinist. Because if they didn't think that it'd be wrong to unplug yourself from the violinist, then they shouldn't think that it'd be wrong to have an abortion in the case of rape. But for somebody who thinks that it would be wrong to have an abortion in the case of rape, they must also think that it'd be wrong to unplug yourself from the violinist. But that's crazy, Thomson thinks. So we're going to move on now, but first I want to just give a formal statement of what Thomas's really central claim is here, and that's this, that having a right to life, as she's granting that a fetus does by granting that it's a person, doesn't guarantee having either a right to be given the use of another person's body or a right to be allowed the continued use of another person's body, even if that's needed for life itself. And the violinist case is supposed to show that. So I'd pause here and make sure you take away this crucial, point. And that result is supposed to transfer to at least some cases of abortion, like the ones resulting from rape that we just considered. However, she's not just trying to show that abortion is okay in cases of rape. In fact, she thinks she can show that abortion is okay across the board. Right? And first, what she wants to do is show that it's okay where the pregnancy resulted from consensual sex instead of rape, where contraception, like a condom, was used. And the way she's going to do this is to develop another analogy. Instead of talking about the violinist, she's going to develop this analogy that I called the burglar with bars on the window. Okay, And this is how it goes. I'm not going to read this one to you from the text. I'll just summarize it quickly. So suppose that the room is stuffy and that you open a window to let air in. Suppose also that you had earlier installed bars on the windows to keep burglars out. But suppose there's a defect in the bars and that a burglar is able to climb in through the window that you opened. Okay. Now, with those details in mind, is this what we should say? Oh, well, since you opened the window, you're partially responsible for the burglar being inside. You opened the window, right? You voluntarily did what enabled him to get in. You opened the window. And you knew full well that there are burglars out there who burgle. Okay? So, because of that, now the burglar has a right to stay in your house. Is that what we should say about this case? Where you opened the window to let air in, but you'd installed bars in the windows to keep the burglars out, but there was a defect in the bars, and so the burglar came through the window? Should we say that, because of this right here, now the burglar has a right to stay in your house? I think Thomson thinks we should only say that if we're nuts, right? Nobody would say that. But what's supposed to follow from that is that it would be nuts to say that a fetus has a right to the use of your body just because you're partially responsible for it being there, because you had consensual sex, and you knew that pregnancies happen, even though you use contraception. So, granted, you're partially responsible for it being there. You engaged in consensual sex. You know that condoms are sometimes defective. So that makes you partially responsible. Everyone can agree to that. You're partially responsible. But, just as we saw up here, the fact that you're partially responsible and that you did something voluntarily doesn't show that the fetus has a right to stay there any more than the burglar case shows that the burglar has a right to stay there. Okay. So that was a kind of quick treatment of that case, but I want to move on now to the second and closely related one, but importantly different analogy. And this is the case with the burglar without bars on the windows. And she uses this to try to show that abortion is okay in cases where the pregnancy resulted from consensual sex, again, not rape, but even where contraception was not used. So this is going to be the same case as the one we just talked about, except now we remove the detail where you didn't install the bars on the window. Okay? So even though we didn't install bars on the window to keep burglars out, it would still be absurd to think that the burglar has a right to the use of your house because he managed to climb in through the window that you opened. You're partially responsible for him being there. You opened the window. Even so, he doesn't have a right to stay there. Even if you didn't put bars up to keep him out, still doesn't have a right to stay there, right? That's supposed to be like something everybody could agree upon. But it seems to follow from that the fetus doesn't have the right to the use of your body, even though you're partially responsible for it being there, and even though you didn't do anything to keep it out, like use contraception, or in the other case, put bars in the window. Okay. So, if you're not buying this, I think you have some explaining to do. I mean, there might really be problems with what Thomson's doing here. In fact, some people think that these analogies don't suffice to establish the analogous cases about abortion. It's not like everybody agrees with her. But there seems to be a good case here, at least in the sense that the analogies are really quite close to one another, between the burglar and the abortion case. But there is one possible disanalogy that could turn out to be quite important, and that's this. And it's something that Thomson anticipates, she expects. Right? And that's that maybe the burglar analogies don't work, maybe the conclusion doesn't transfer to the abortion cases because there's the important difference that the burglar's not innocent, came into your house, doing something illegal or doing something wrong, whereas the fetus didn't have any, ill intention. The fetus didn't make the decision to come into your house, even though it wasn't supposed to. So the fetus is innocent, the burglar's not, so there's a big disanalogy in these cases, and that would be a problem, right? So Thomson thinks somebody might say this, maybe you or somebody who'd want to say this. And it does seem like that's a problem. However, we can't just stop here, because she anticipates this objection and has a reply to it. And the way she replies to it is to develop yet another analogy. And this analogy is supposed to take care of your worry when you thought, well, the fetus is innocent, whereas the burglar's not, so she hasn't succeeded in showing what she had to. So if, just as a note, in your discussion posts or in your papers, if you think that, this is a problem, that the fetus is innocent whereas the burglar is not, you can't just point out that fact and stop there. You're going to have to respond to the way that she responds to that objection. And this is how she does it. She develops what is referred to as the people seed analogy. The key thing to note here is that these people seeds, unlike burglars, are innocent. Okay? So, but in all other ways, the case is supposed to be the same, really, as the burglar case. So, if you accept the conclusion of her people seed case, right, then you can no longer say, oh, but that result doesn't transfer to abortion, since fetuses are innocent and people seeds aren't. Because people seeds are innocent, unlike the burglars who weren't. Okay? So, I'm going to leave it to you to work through this final analogy, the people seed analogy. And in some ways, this is the most important one. It's also tricky. But it will be profitable, I think, for you to try to sort out the mechanics of this analogy in the way that I just did by way of summary with the violinist case and the two versions of the burglar case. So you need to work that out. Make sure you understand how it is that it deals with, or how it is that it's supposed to rectify the problem from the burglar cases, which was that the burglars plausibly aren't innocent, whereas the fetus is. That's the whole point of this new analogy, is that it's supposed to account for that, so you no longer have that objection open to you about the innocence of the fetus. Make sure that's perfectly clear. And also, here's one other important thing. Be able to figure this out. Which of the following is the people seed case supposed to be analogous to? We showed what, the burglar with bars in the windows is supposed to be analogous to consensual sex with contraception. The burglar case without bars in the windows is supposed to be analogous to consensual sex without contraception. The violinist case is supposed to be analogous to cases of rape. Now your question is, what is the people seed case supposed to be analogous to? And I'll narrow it down for you. Either abortion where the pregnancy resulted from consensual sex with contraception or without contraception. And so make sure that in reading the details of that case, you're able to identify which of these two it is that it's supposed to be analogous to. And sort of wrapping up now, there's one final important thing, and that's that if Thomson has succeeded in her project, what she's shown is that abortion is morally okay, even if a fetus is a person from the moment of conception, and that it therefore has a right to life. If she's succeeded in everything she's done, that's what she's proven. But note this, it might not even be true that a fetus is a person from the moment of conception. She's just been assuming that it is, just for the sake of argument. In fact, remember at the beginning, she gave us reasons for thinking that it's not a person from the moment of conception. But again, she just wanted to show that even if it were, it still wouldn't follow that abortion is morally wrong. So that's one of the reasons this paper is as powerful as it is that there's a lot of debate about whether a fetus is a person from the moment of conception. If it turns out not to be, then presumably abortion early on is morally okay. What she's doing is sort of bolstering the case by saying, even if it is a person, abortion's still morally okay. So that's just, again, to gesture toward the grand architecture, the overview of this project. And then the final thing from her paper that you need to be clear on is something I'm not going to summarize here, but it's this. Having said everything that she has in this paper, she does admittedly think that sometimes, even though a woman has a moral right to have an abortion, she ought not to have an abortion, at least in some cases. So we need to be able to identify which kinds of cases fall into this category, where even though a woman has a moral right to it, she shouldn't do it. And equally important, why is it that even though she has a moral right to it, she shouldn't do it? Okay, and so that's it. Now, good luck.